Lord, take me where you want me to go. Let me meet who you want me to meet. Tell me what you want me to say, and please keep me out of your way. Amen. Please be seated. You know, I have joked before that I can close my eyes and do a seating chart for you folks, but some of you, and you know who you are, have moved this morning, and you have thrown your rector off as I see you shift from side to side. I'm used to the Schultzes over there, and you've moved over here. It has shocked me this morning. Do you remember as a child, and I'm talking to the baby boomers in the room mostly, about a little magnet and bearded man game that you used to buy at the 5 and dime? It was made of a piece of cardboard with a comical face on it and a plastic covering, and it was filled with metal filings. It came with a stylus with a magnet at the end of it. Do I see some heads nodding? You know the game I'm talking about? I always wanted one of those. I was constantly begging for one, and they would get broken as soon as I got them, it seemed like. But I was fascinated by this. The goal was to pick up the filings, for those of you who don't know this game, and to direct it around this comical head to form hair and a beard and a mustache and anything else you wanted to do with it. Being the creative type, I loved this game. Out of confusion, the magnet brought order. Our gospel lesson this morning deals with this very same subject. Not the steel filings and magnets, of course, but Jesus and the order that he brings to life. I don't know about you, but I've often noticed just how scattered and jumbled life seems at times. No order at all, just like those steel filings in the game. How do we reconcile the joy and sorrow, the love and the hate, the life and the death that we all experience? How can there be a plan to things? We look at life and we wonder how we might be able to make some kind of sense of it. I have a feeling that's why you're here today and every time you come to worship. We look at all the brokenness in this world and we wonder, how can we comprehend it? How do we fit into it? How do we live through it? Often we look at life and see all that brokenness and all that tragedy that's around us, and we tend to make God a scapegoat for all the world's misfortunes. Earthquakes, hurricanes, tornadoes, volcanoes, they're often seen as signs of God's judgment somehow. Illness, accidents, and death are viewed as being somehow decided by God as he plays games with his human family. It's easy to understand why we think that this way when we hear ministers declaring so. I remember well where I was when I heard with my own ears Pat Robertson, the televangelist, say that Hurricane Katrina was God's wrath brought onto New Orleans for its legendary sinfulness. So vile and so untrue, I found myself shouting at my television screen. While it is true that God works in all circumstances, it is not true that God wills and decides all of the individual experiences that make up our lives. God does not snuff out the life of an infant or a small child. He does not create a tragedy that takes the life of a young person who has a lifetime ahead of them. He does not decide that a parent will become a victim of cancer and die a slow death, leaving a family in anguish and chaos. He does not decide to inflict upon a person a chronic and disabling condition just to test that person's faith. He does not end a relationship just to give a person a stronger character. He does not cause these things, but he is there in the midst of the suffering. In today's gospel lesson, death is seen at its worst. It has struck a youth, claiming its prey long before the young man has lived out a normal span of years. Here, death had struck a particularly vicious blow, taking the only son of a widow. Widows in that day were pitiable in any case, but they had no legal right, you see, and they could not receive inheritance. No pensions, no social security to fall back on. They were dependent on their sons or the relatives of their husbands, whose support could not be counted on. The death of her son had left this widow defenseless in a cruel world. Here is the tragedy of humanity at its worst. The widow's tears were an eloquent testimony. Death had indeed come in a cruel way to this lady. Then notice, out of the chaos, out of the confusion, out of the disorder of this moment, Jesus comes in. Jesus was traveling with his disciples, and he's coming into the city of Nain. He saw this funeral crowd with the mourners leading their way, playing their flutes and their cymbals, uttering in a kind of frenzy their shrill cries of grief. He knew she was a widow because there were no other men around her as she walked in her grief. So the text says, when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her and said to her, "Do not weep." Jesus was moved to action because he could sense her pain, her despair, her loneliness, and her utter hopelessness at this moment. Then he does something for her that in her strongest prayers she could not have conceived of. Jesus went and he touched the bier and said, "Young man, I say to you, arise." And the dead man did the unthinkable. He sat up and he began to speak. The miracle of life, as important as it is not the main point of this story. The point is that God, through Jesus, came to someone in their utter moment of hopelessness, and that person, the mother, was given renewed hope. Her life was filled with purpose and meaning as she realized that God cared even for her. She was not alone and had not been forgotten. We need to look beyond the miracle of this story to the action and heart of Jesus and what it tells us about him. You'll notice that the woman didn't ask anything of Jesus. The woman didn't even exhibit faith. Jesus was moved to action because of his love, because he understood the brokenness, the utter despair of this woman. Because Jesus, you see, is the suffering Messiah, because he was a victim on the cross, because he suffered and experienced pain, he knows and can feel with us. He can feel all the brokenness of our lives, folks, all the chaos, all the confusion that we experience, and all that despair that ultimately comes into every one of our lives. Jesus can reach into our lives, and with his hand of compassion, he helped this widow because his heart was aching for her. His heart was filled with pain for her, and for her utter sense of hopelessness. And because he suffered, because he experienced what we have experienced, his heart can reach out to each and every one of us as well. Folks, life is a lonely journey, and we struggle desperately to get through it all by ourselves. But we really aren't doing it all by ourselves. Jesus comes to recharge our spiritual batteries just when we feel them dead, just when we're incapable of being recharged. Trust me when I say we are the most open to feeling the power of God's intervention in our lives when we feel the most broken, the most hopeless, the most alone. When we are in those throes of grief and despair, when we feel the most lost, Jesus is there, a presence beyond our understanding. Joe Bailey, in his book, View from a Hearse, I love that title, View from a Hearse, says that one of the best contributions we can make to a person going through intense suffering and loss is our presence without words. Let me repeat that. Our presence without words. He said, don't try to prove anything to a survivor or a sufferer. An arm around their shoulder, a firm grip of the hand, a gentle kiss on the cheek. These are the proofs grief needs, not logical understandings. Joe went on to say, I was sitting torn by grief. Someone came and talked to me of God's dealings, of why it had happened, of hope beyond the grave. He talked constantly. He said things that I knew were true. I was unmoved, except to wish that he would go away. And he finally did. Another came and sat beside me. He didn't talk. He didn't ask leading questions. He just sat beside me for an hour or so. He listened when I said something, answered briefly, prayed simply, and left. I was moved. I was comforted. I hated to see him go. He just sat beside me for an hour or so. Isn't that what we really need when we are in the grips of despair and grief? No words, no lecture, no explanation, just a presence of Christ through another. The presence of Christ through the Spirit working with our spirit to bring us a measure of His grace in our suffering. Perhaps you will be given the opportunity soon to be that presence for someone else, to sit quietly for an hour or so, to take someone to dinner, to read to someone in the hospital, to remind someone of Christ just by your presence. Folks, remember that Christ is never far away. And in the hour of deepest despair and loneliness, it is our opportunity, nay, our calling, to remind others who are suffering that Christ is near and full of compassion because of our quiet presence. I pray that you each will invite Him into your life and live into that calling. Amen.